Hello everyone, I'm Kevin, always known as Forum BX257, here to bring you another 1980s G.I. Joe tour review. And today I'll be taking a look at the G.I. Joe's Bridge Layer tank, the 1985 Toss and Cross, and its driver, Tollbooth. Now, I've done a Toss and Cross and Tollbooth review quite a number of years ago, so it's high time for me to do a re-review right now. Tollbooth makes his first comic book appearance in the Old Mobile comic run of G.I. Joe in issue number 51, but it isn't until issue number 76 that we get to see comic rendition of the Toss and Cross. But both Tollbooth and the Toss and Cross make their cartoon debut together in the 1985 Season 1 opener, The Pyramids of Darkness in Part 3. One very interesting thing about the Toss and Cross is its release. Because while I've called it a 1985 vehicle, it actually makes its debut in 1984. In the last quarter of 1984, Sears had first dibs on selling the Toss and Cross in what we would call today a pre-release exclusive. The US 1984 Sears Wish Book also shows the Toss and Cross as an exclusive for the Christmas season. It was released to general retail in the spring of 1985. This is my Canadian Autumn Sears sale catalog, printed earlier. Check out the Tollbooth prototype made out of a Steeler figure. The Toss and Cross is one of those toys that gives off the impression of being bigger than it actually is. And that's mostly because not only do we have the tank portion, but we also have these large bridge halves being stored on top. The tank portion itself is only about 10 inches long, which is a better than medium-sized vehicle to be sure, but it's not really a huge vehicle either. To give an example, here is your standard G.I. Joe tank, the Mobat, which is basically the same size as a tank portion of the Toss and Cross. Now before I get into the features of the tank, I'd like to demonstrate exactly how the bridge layer function works. Now the bridges themselves are just sort of a clamshell design with hinges at the back, and the only way it's really connected to the tank is by these front arms here. So what you do is, you just take the top half of the bridge and just accordion it out, like that. Now one of the reasons why I wanted to demonstrate that is because that is basically how the real world bridge layer tank works. Yes, the Toss and Cross is actually based on a real-world military vehicle called the M60 AVLB, or Armored Vehicle Launched Bridge. It's based on the M60 Sherman, and while the actual base tank is not exactly the same, Toss and Cross's side skirts are closer to what the Mobat looks like. In order to complete the transformation, you have to remove the arm from the bridge halves. And that requires squeezing these little arms so that they come out of the holes. Now that's actually a very hair-raising proposition to do because the old plastic is really not meant to be flexed like that. With the bridge extended out like this, the Toss and Cross is now a whopping 24 inches long. That's 2 feet. Of course, you're not going to keep it like that. You're going to disengage the arm and let this thing drive over it, or let other vehicles drive over this. So after deploying your bridge, now you can just fold this arm back up and all the way back. When this was attached to the bridge, it would have been a bit upwards like this, but now you can pull it all the way back, and you'll notice that there are these straight pegs here, which fit into the hollows of the back of the arms, which is a nice use of the hollow portions of the plastic. And they just sit on there, and they're relatively sturdy. They don't rattle around now. The bridge layer has a lot of interesting surface detail, but it's also mostly flat. And while I would argue if that's kind of boring, you can also place a lot of things on there, and they're not going to tumble off. Especially Tollbooth's sledgehammer, which really doesn't have anywhere to go in here. And speaking of him, you'll notice that this thing actually does have 2 seats. So you can actually fit a second figure in there. It doesn't have any foot pegs on the surface, but I don't think you really need to have that. Another interesting thing is this thing has two swiveling cannons. Of course, this back one is going to hit the rear pylon, which is meant for the bridge, and the second one will do the same thing. And while they're the same cannon design, you'll notice that they aren't mounted symmetrically. The one on the right is far back and the one on the left is forward. Unfortunately, the cockpits are not detailed, and due to the artwork on the box, you would tend to think that the driver position is on the left, and well, it can be whichever side you want it to be. I tend to think that the box art is actually flipped from how it should be, but again, that's up to you which one you want to put your driver figure in, because like I said, the cockpits are not detailed. There's no steering wheel or anything like that, or control panel, so you just put it in whichever side that suits you best. Unlike the Mobat, we have fake treads and just these little dummy wheels. So this thing rolls around quite easily, I would say. It's actually rather a lot like the 1983 Wolverine vehicle in that respect, and unfortunately the underside is not detailed at all. And finally, we do have a tow hook on the back. One unfortunate design flaw of the Toss and Cross is the fact that its rear tow hook is so high off the ground. It's much higher than many other vehicles. So if you want to use your Toss and Cross as a towed vehicle when you're not using it for the bridge layer portion, you're kind of limited as to what your choices are. I found that only the 1983 Whirlwind Twin Battle Gun was really good, as well as the 1984 Mountain Howitzer. Now again, this does sort of point downwards when hooked on, but it still has a little bit of clearance at least on the bottom here, not like the HAL. And I've also found that because the back portion of the Toss and Cross has a lot of really flat empty space, you can actually put the Mountain Howitzer's extra parts, like the crate, and the tripod with the binoculars on there, and they fit just fine. When unfolded, the bridge halves are a substantial size. They're around 16 inches long. That's quite a gap that you could actually put this thing over. And they're 6.5 inches wide, which is more than wide enough for many of the G.I. Joe vehicles in the 1982 to 1986 range. The bridge halves are really sturdy, and so is the tank for the most part due to its simplicity. However, it does have one major design flaw, and that is in its bridge lifting arm. Now this is what really holds this thing up, and as I've said before, you have to squeeze this thing at the tips in order to fit it into the slots here. You have to squeeze it to put it in, and you have to squeeze it again to take it out, which is part of the play pattern. Unfortunately, what I have here is actually a variant, a late fix to what was an early design problem which plagued, unfortunately, 90% of the Toss and Crosses made for the North American market. Now, as you can see, this is what most of the lifting arms look like, a solid plastic bar. Now just imagine trying to squeeze that. You're just begging for this thing to have stress marks and eventually break, which is what a lot of them did. Hasbro, being Hasbro, tried to fix the problem later on and made the V-shape that I have here. If you're looking for a specific variant on the aftermarket, I actually wouldn't say one is more valuable than the other because, well, as I said, the solid bar one breaks so often that if you find that one or this rarer V-shaped one, you should really count yourself as lucky that you have one which has an intact arm at all. I know that this thing was released with the V-arm in South America. I think Brazil and Argentina might have gotten it, but the colors of the South American releases were much darker than the North American release of the green. I do have to say though, the clamshell design of the bridge halves actually makes for some interesting storage space. And now it's time to take a look at Tollbooth. First, take a look at his accessories. He only comes with one, and that is his sledgehammer. It's a fairly plain plastic sledgehammer at that. I even have to warn you that the actual shaft is a little bit thick for figure, so you do have to be careful that if you're really trying to get it in there and it doesn't really want to go, try not to really force it in there because you could just break the thumbs. Tollbooth is one of those figures that collectors either really like or just really dismiss. I've never heard of anyone actively disliking the figure because, I mean, for the most part, he is kind of military colors and he's well dressed. But there's no getting around the fact that he looks like an engineer because of his orange hard hat here. Now, sure, you can give him a rifle and a backpack and things like that, but yeah, you just can't get away with that. But on the other hand, he's really well done for a combat engineer. His helmet is actually on a slant, his vest is open, and his dog tags are dangling around him. I mean, he looks like he's been on the job for 3 days straight. That's a lot of personality packed into the sculpt. And, yeah, his sledgehammer is a perfect accessory for him, I think. Like the Dreadnoks, Tollbooth here was a figure which might have been mainly released in 1985, but he was definitely constructed in 1984. Because he lacks a ball-jointed neck. I mean, sometimes you don't really get a lot of range out of the necks, even when they're ball-jointed. So just having him turn left and right is good enough for most poses anyway. One very interesting thing about Tollbooth's color scheme, however, is that it matches really well with the 1984 version of Roadblock. Now, Roadblock being one of my favorite figures, I generally have this guy kind of out front and just by himself. But if you're looking for a co-pilot for your toss and cross, I think a spare Roadblock is a really good choice. There are quite a few G.I. Joes who have engineering as a specialty in some form or another, but you do have to admit here that Tollbooth really does look like a construction worker. He almost looks more at home with Tonka toys than he does with the Action Army series of G.I. Joe vehicles. There just really weren't a lot of utility or construction vehicles in the G.I. Joe line. Obviously, that just wasn't the priority. But he is a really good representation of that Army construction worker look. However, I'm going to compare him to the 1987 Hardtop figure. Now this guy also has a construction helmet, even though he wasn't really an engineer as such, but he totally can be used as such. With his pale blue, he's not really an army engineer. He looks like something from the Navy or the Air Force or something like that. And also very curious that he came with a pistol. Whereas I don't really think it was a really necessary accessory for this guy. One interesting bit of trivia here is that a lot of collectors tend to think of the prototype versions of Hardtop, or at least the initial mock-ups of the original Hardtop, were just Tollbooth, just painted over in a blue and white color scheme. And while they did reuse the head, the actual body for that mock-up was a completely different figure. I believe a 1985 Footloose figure. Tollbooth's real name is a really funny homage to a real-life person, Charles Goren, who was a bridge card game player. The other really strange thing is that they've gone and put the X in there for nothing, meaning that he doesn't have a middle name. So somewhere along the line, when Tollbooth was applying for the military and the application form had print your middle name, he just put a random X in there just to indicate that he doesn't have one. Now here's something that I thought was an error at first, but turns out to be perfectly fine. Tollbooth's rank and insignia. On the file card, it's listed as SB5 for Specialist 5, which is an Army rank that doesn't exist anymore. It was phased out in 1985, ironically, and this is what that rank insignia would look like. But this is the rank insignia placed on the figure, which looks a lot like an E8 First Sergeant insignia. That's a difference of 3 ranks and a completely different career path. However, it is not an error. Ron Rudat and the other Hasbro designers were well known for giving their characters older military uniforms and patches, and that is one of these cases. The figure's rank insignia is supposed to reference a First Sergeant Technician patch from World War II. Possibly, Tollbooth is honoring an older relative who was in the same service. For obvious reasons, the G.I. Joe line doesn't have a lot of utility vehicles. As a matter of fact, I think I have every one in the vintage run, like right here. But I can definitely say that the Toss and Cross is the king of that small construction battalion squad. And today I'll be taking a look at the fact that the tow hook is actually really hard. But they're around. Well, that's all the time I have right now. Please check out my Facebook page for more information and behind the scenes photos for these reviews. Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for next time to see another 1980s G.I. Joe toy review. See you then.